Alright, I had another planned, but I'm gonna do a different one because of circumstances involving a disagreement I'm having online. Plus, I'd like to get this out there because I'd like to express my views on this. So let's talk about the three children of the Enlightenment. Now, there are three, them being liberalism, socialism, and fascism. I think I might have flipped them. I don't know. You know what? Screw it. I'll just fix the writing, and you can correct me in the comments. So anyways, these are the three children of the Enlightenment. You may disagree with fascism, but I will defend it later. So let's start with the three main beliefs of the Enlightenment: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, you might recognize a few of these. And you might recognize these three in this order as the French motto. So for liberty, you of course mainly have the liberals. Equality, socialists. And of course, fraternity or nationalism, fascists. That being said, it should be noted they all contain sparks of all three. See, for fascists, this may shock you, but they do believe in liberty. But not the liberty you and I believe in. When I say I believe in liberty, I mean natural rights, freedoms, etc. When a liberal says it, they usually mean natural rights or human rights. Generally, they lean towards human rights now, but for classical liberals, it's more natural rights. And a socialist will obviously believe in the liberty of the people, so usually human rights. Here's the thing. The fascist believes in liberty for the nation, and thus the state. So the state should be free to do what it wants, because that's how they think. They think in terms of nations. So they want the nation to be free from foreign interference and to do its own thing. However, they do not believe that for the individual, because they believe all individuals should be part of this great national machine, essentially, that the state is. Because the nation to them is the state. There is no separation between a person and the state. You just are part of it, in the fascist thought. Now, fascists also believe in equality, but it's the idea that we are all equal before the nation. We are all cogs in the machine. That is how they view it. So, no part is less important than the other, but they are all still part of a machine whose churning ensures the nation keeps going forwards. Socialism's the same. As I mentioned, they have their own beliefs on liberty, but they also have their own beliefs on fraternity or brotherhood. That being the idea of international unification of the working class and the people behind socialist beliefs. Their equality is also more equity than anything, so in other words, nonsense, but to be frank, equality is nonsense regardless. And that's the thing. They all have specs of each part. Liberals, for example, believe in national fraternity in terms of self-determination. So when someone says that a person should be able to decide where they live, they believe that's self-determination, and simultaneously they hold it that if the majority of a nation wishes to be independent, to rule itself, it should be allowed to. That is the basic standard of self-determination established following World War II. The liberals, of course, have a belief in equality that usually is equality of opportunity, though it's started to turn more towards equity as things have gone on. But they all have these roots. And one may doubt liberalism being tied to nationalism because they like to call it a conservative thing now, but I give you a year, 1848. For those who don't know what happened, it's called the Springtime of the Peoples in Europe, and what happened was basically a lot of liberal revolts over nationality. So if you can imagine in Germany, I'll use Germany as an example, there were people forming constitutions, establishing a diet, making their own state with the intention of uniting all of Germany behind one thing, one nation and one state. Holy cow, that's a bad arm. But yeah, so the idea was that better looking person, still garbage, but better. Essentially, the nation state should be formed. That was the liberals' initial idea. The conservatives at the time did not want that because they were, usually multi-ethnic. For example, even Prussia, one of the kingdoms at the time, ruled over a large subsection of Poles in its mostly German kingdom. As a result, they weren't too keen on the idea of nationalism, especially because that usually meant the Poles would start acting up again. Austria especially was not a big fan because, you got the Hungarians, you got the Southern Slavs of many different varieties, Ukrainians and other Eastern Slavs, the Poles and several Western Slavs, including Czechs and Slovaks, Romanians, and of course the Italians. Needless to say, the ancient regimes of Europe actually hated the liberals for this. They hated the idea of nationalism at first because it naturally resulted in their minorities rising up against them. In fact, it's why Germany, for example, put in so many programs to try to assimilate the Poles and later the Danes that they had under their rule. Because they were worried, and understandably so, that revolts, riots, and civil wars would come if these peoples were still in the state. Because if you're a liberal who's Polish, you naturally believe your state should have self-determination. You believe the Poles should have their own state, and thus Prussia, later Germany, Austria, and Russia should be kicked out. Granted, Poland's pretty easy to use here because Poland was basically the thorn in everyone's side in Europe because everyone in Europe decided, hey, let's bully Poland. And so they got back at it through constant revolts. Gotta respect the Poles, honestly. But that's the thing. The nation-state is a liberal creation. The idea of nationalism was liberal in nature. Now, one might ask, why do the socialists and fascists look different from the liberals then, if they're all from the Enlightenment? Well, essentially, liberalism was the blueprint. See, the liberals had a lot of success, especially after 1848. Even conservative Germany gave voting rights to certain people. It wasn't universal suffrage, mind you, but they still gave some level of representation to the people. Austria did similar, Russia was slower behind, but eventually even they modernized and established some level of representation and, of course, economic reforms in line with liberal beliefs. So, liberalism was firmly established in Europe and the United States. In fact, the American Revolution, you could say, was even a liberal revolt in and of itself, filled with ideas of liberty, the equality of man, and brotherhood of peoples. But what happened? Well, see, you take this blueprint, and two different ideas occur. See, you have the socialists, who look at this and say, we need to care more about people. The people aren't getting what they need even in this liberal society. So, they suggest socialism. They develop their own things. So, essentially, they reformed what they saw as the flaw of liberalism to make socialism. Fascism was similar but delayed. See, they took from liberalism, of course, and then they took from socialism, and they did a dual reformation, taking from both and concluding that in order for the nation and the state to truly be united, and thus nationalism to achieve its full purpose, the state and the nation need to become one. Now, what that means, for those who don't understand it, was that, in essence, what they wanted was to make it so that every single action of the state was for the interests of the nation, and furthermore, that the nation and the state would be so intrinsically tied that they could not be separated. Thus, you get fascism. And so that's why you see its economic policy be so interventionist compared to even more extreme liberals. For a reference, they were having people constantly watch factories in Germany. Like, imagine a person being hired specifically to watch a factory to ensure it's staying within party lines. That is what the Nazis did. That is what other fascists did. They had a lot of control over the economy. And so, what ended up happening was the fascists looked at socialism, saw that they did not believe it worked. They looked at liberalism and believed that international capital would destroy the nation. And so they said, we must unite these things and form our own nations and states. They should have wanted to change the nations themselves to make them more compatible with the state. Now, one might ask, why do we always hear fascism as far right and nationalism as well? So, let's start with nationalism. Why is nationalism right wing? Well, I sort of answered this earlier when I mentioned that liberalism is the blueprint. The liberals won. In the end, they did. Constant revolts, Belgium, constitutions, Napoleon. See, liberalism as a whole won the 19th and later 20th centuries. And so nationalism, this firm belief in a people's ideas, in a culture, in a nation. Well, guess what happened? This became the norm. Nationalism became the default. As a result, it was considered a very centrist belief for a long time. Later moving right-wing as internationalism became a bigger and bigger deal. And so it's right-wing for the same reason that a penny left at the start of a train track is to the right of you when you go left on the train. The penny hasn't moved. We have. Nationalism used to be the standard. But as internationalism grew and grew and grew, naturally the result for nationalism was that it got further and further right. Now one might ask, too, why do we call fascism far right? And it's because of these two. See, fascism is not well liked by the other two. Quite the opposite of liked, they actively despise it. And there's good reasons for all of them to hate each other. In fact, they all do to some extent. But fascism especially was the annoying younger child who decided not just to disagree with their older brothers, but to straight up burn them to the ground to ensure their beliefs. Remember who won World War II? The Comintern and the Allies. It was the US, UK, and Soviet Union that come out the best out of World War II. And so, think about what they're thinking. You just had a 6-year-long fight, 4 years in the US's case, with one of the states who straight up did not want you to exist because you're either socialist, liberal, or you had stuff they wanted. And in that, they deemed it unacceptable to be fascist. Understandable. In fact, I believe it's still part of Italy's constitution that a fascist can't run. But, with that being there, you naturally have the question of, well, how should we talk about these fascists? Simple. They lied. They pretended that fascism was not an Enlightenment ideology. They argued it was not. But here's the thing. Fascism, as its belief system exists, could only exist within the Enlightenment framework of the nation-state and egalitarianism, along with the advances that liberalism brought, including mass surveillance, political activism, etc. See, the New World, as it was formed as fascism was formed, was not the world that you would think a, old ideology would come from. It was rapidly advancing. But with that came, naturally, questions of, okay, what do we do with these new things? And thus, fascism was born. Mass surveillance, alright, let's use that on our people to ensure that they are following the state's interests to preserve the nation. But liberals and socialists didn't want to accept that, so they either said fascism is capitalism in decay in the case of socialists, or the liberals who said, oh yeah, fascism is actually an old ancient thing. No, it isn't. There is not a single fascist state before the 1920s. The first fascist state was, guess who? Italy. Yeah, fascism is Enlightenment in origin, taking from its ideas but deeming it that nationalism, and particularly the nation-state, must be prioritized over all else. It does not matter how free your market is. If it doesn't work for the nation in their views, no. Every single entity that does not work in the benefit of the nation in their eyes, nationalized or given to party friends. That is how fascists handled things. That's not something you can do in an old absolutist regime. In fact, quite the opposite. Because of nobility, doing practically anything was a nightmare for most of feudal times. And by the time of absolute monarchies, with Louis XIV, you still had a lot of influence from the church and religious beliefs to really do anything on the scale that fascists actually advocated for. It was literally impossible. Like, you couldn't. So these two lied about fascism and said, no, it's not an Enlightenment ideology. I'm sure you've all heard of fascism, or at least those who are interested in politics have. Yeah, that's nonsense. If you read the doctrine of fascism yourself, you'll notice that Mussolini is not saying, we are an ancient thing being revived. What he's saying is, we're the next era. The socialists, they had ideas, but they weren't the final product. They weren't the final way to ensure the world is the best. No, we are. And it takes from a very progressive, liberal in origin view of history called Whig history, which has been modified by a lot of groups to essentially say the same thing. We are the end. We are the end game. Forgive me on that. But yes, Whig history believed that fundamentally history progresses constantly, and that it will always go to a freer, more liberal world. The socialists took that and then came up with the idea of Marxist scientific dialectics, where he said, it's scientific. We are going to be the guys who win at the end. It freaking isn't, but that's what he said. And fascism was pulling the same thing. We are the final stage. They believed that they were going to be the New World Order, and that all the previous beliefs were going to get swept out. They weren't old beliefs. No. They were the newest. And they believed that these two had to be defeated for the New World Order to come. So, what you essentially see here is these two are lying to save their own face because they don't want to be associated with fascists. Understandable. While simultaneously, they are all accusing each other of being the origin of it. Socialists are saying it's capitalism, therefore it's those liberals and their free markets. The liberals are saying, actually, no, it's the ancient ways, those guys we fought a long time ago and defeated. Meanwhile, the fascists are saying, I'm neither of those. I am you, but better. And so that is what happened. These are all children of Enlightenment thought. Collectivism, in part, but also the ideas of the Enlightenment taken to their whole points. If you would fight for liberty above the other two, and so long as you still believe in the other two to some extent, you're a liberal. Equality over the other two, socialist. Fraternity over the other two, fascist. There are levels and differences between the three, but they are all still connected in origin. The liberals set the path for a new world. They overthrew ancient regimes, installed mass suffrage, ensured republics, and ensured free markets and later regulations upon them. Socialists pushed for more worker protections and later nationalization of key industries. The fascists pushed the idea of the nation-state to its extreme and were butchered because of it. Understandably so, but they were still, pushing things. And that's the thing. See, it's easy to say, that thing I don't like, that's on my side or theirs. It's much harder to say, yeah, fine, those ideas came from us. You don't want to say, oh yeah, that person, they got that from me, if it's a bad idea. Like, imagine if I said, the idea that people should suffer came from me. Me saying that is something I hope I never have to. Because I don't believe that people should suffer. I accept sometimes it's a necessity to get things to where they need to be, but I don't like it. But for the liberal, the idea of admitting that fascism came from, at start, their ideas, and that it stems from the same thing as them, is freaking horrifying. Same with the socialist. That is not something they want to do. So they're saying, nope, no, not us. These are all Enlightenment ideologies in origin. I've already explained why I don't believe equality is true. In fact, I can do it right here real quick. Humans are individuals, therefore there cannot be inequality between them. I am not you, you are not me. Diversity disproves this itself. If I have different skills and you have different skills, we are not equally capable. Therefore, equality does not freaking exist. And we don't even judge people equally because we tend to have preferences. Welcome to life. As a result, equality is nonsense. Technically, all three of these would be nonsense by the extent, but I'll say that for later. But I would like to bring back to the final conclusion, and my statement regarding them all being similar. Just because fascism has similarities with liberalism and socialism does not make them the same. I would not complain about a socialist being near a fascist. Frankly, I would still disagree with the socialists heavily, but I would not put it over their heads that they have some ideas similar to fascists. No, that's pointless. I have ideas similar to a lot of people. I have ideas similar to liberals, despite me denouncing them several times. I have ideas that I have similar to socialists, and by that I mean my internationalism. Beyond that, I freaking hate the socialists and don't care much from them. And I have ideas necessary for any authoritarian regime. That being, I believe the state should exist and it should enforce its laws to the utmost efficiency. See, we all have ideas from different areas and belief systems. I've stolen from a bunch. And liberalism, libertarianism, socialism, fascism, absolute monarchism, all of them have their own, similarities with each other just because sometimes you come across the same ideas. Sometimes you do, sometimes you reject them, but still there's some similarity inherent just because we're going from the same pot, essentially. Taking the same ideas, reforming them, adapting them into qualified ethics and functional systems to run a country. That's naturally going to result in overlap. So there is literally no point to say, well, because liberalism is closer to fascism, therefore my beliefs are better than theirs. Or because socialism is closer to fascism, I win. No. If something is bad, it's bad on its own. These two do not impact my judgment of this. These two are different from each other still. So I would not say this is bad because this and this, or this is bad because this and this. I'd say this is bad because it's freaking fascism. And this is bad because it's socialism, and this is bad because it believes in equality, which doesn't exist. See, I will gladly handle them separately, and I should handle them separately. Because this may be the blueprint, and these may be the reformed results, but fundamentally, these are different beliefs. That's why I separated them. If they were the same, they would not be separate. And thus, for these three brothers of the Enlightenment, I can safely say this. I don't like them, but they're not the same, and we should not treat them as such. Have a good day.